Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? Your hosts are Steve Becker and myself, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us at our website, horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, this is the trigger warning. This is a horror podcast, so we talk about horror things, so we could delve into sensitive subjects involving violence or abuse or foul language, but it's not all about that. It's just some things that we could discuss, so we have to bring that up. So with that out of the way, we also want to thank our Patreon supporters. Steve and I both live paycheck to paycheck, so we definitely appreciate how meaningful it can be to offer even $1 here or there. But you don't even need to do that. Patreon actually has a free tier. So even if you can't offer financial support, you can still sign up for the free tier. Or you can do things like liking, sharing, subscribing, and all those social media things. Or
just fun stuff.
Just talk about it. Because we talk about it. So you should talk about it. And then get a conversation going. Right, Steve?
Yes. Yep.
Right then. So with that, what do we got coming up?
Same stuff as usual. Nothing on the convention calendar at the moment. Still doing 3 events weekly on a Discord server. We've got a link to that on our website. Again, horrormakesushappy.com. On that page, there's a link to our Linktree page, which has links to everything else. So if you just go to the Linktree page, it'll be on there. Today we are talking to Peter Atkins, author and screenwriter best known for his work on Hellraiser 2, 3, and Bloodline, Nightbreed, and Wishmaster 1. Welcome, Peter.
Oh, thank you, guys. Thank you very much for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Yes. Our pleasure. Glad to have you. Before we get into the meat of the interview, you want to let us know what you're currently working on?
Oh, God, how to start an interview on a slightly awkward note. I've been working on a TV thing for actually over a year now. An old friend of mine invited me on board. But these days, and this is new to an old hand like me, you have to sign NDAs. And so I can't actually, I mean, it's no big secret. It's nothing, but I am apparently not allowed to discuss the show until and unless the parties I cannot name, they're so, they have such an iron grip on press releases and publicity these days that so let's just say I've been happily and gainfully employed on a screen project,
but it's
which
a secret.
is now in secret. What a ridiculous thing. I'm so sorry.
No. That makes it more enticing.
I had a recent short story appearance in an anthology. My most recent collection came out 2 years ago. 2 years ago. I better get back on that. But yeah, so I am working, but I can't talk about it. Thank you.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, right. Once we stop recording, I'll happily tell you guys. But
is that something we'll have to keep in for the Patreon supporters, or no?
Oh, I do. Oh, God, I don't know. These they are so
The only reason I say that is because if the Patreon supporters can't hear it either, then I will just hit stop and then we'll talk about it. That's all.
Okay. Sure. I'll text you while we're talking, and then
well, that'll work because our phones are turned off, so that we won't get it until later anyway.
Sure.
Well, the theme of this podcast is less about your own body of work and more about what you've been a fan of. But that said, it's not meant to be a therapy session. So if there's any questions we ask that you don't want to answer, you can say pass and we'll move on. But starting with childhood, what are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
Right. Well, I am a child of the mid 1950s. I was born in 1955, and so many of my generation, it's really all the usual suspects. In fact, there's this name now that people have, a little older than me, a little younger than me, and my age throw around, which are the monster kids. And it refers specifically, I think, to that generational lump of people who were raised on Forry Ackerman's famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, and were lucky enough to be the first generation to see what was then classic horror finally get released on TV. So I'm right in that demographic. And I grew up with, indeed, famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, with Universal movies on British television, Hammer movies on British television too. There was a very popular paperback original book series in the late 50s, right through the 60s, called the Pan Book of Horror Stories. So, all that stuff. So those would be my earliest exposure to, but you said scary stuff. And as I'm sure a lot of your guests have said, and probably you guys yourself, it's not like any of that stuff scared me. I didn't get scared by anything, which I'm happy to talk about. We can talk about that later. But as the title of your podcast implies, it was this stuff that made me happy. It was like, so I would talk about monster stuff. I mean, we probably would throw the word horror around, but I did not feel afraid of Frankenstein, Dracula, The Bride, Phantom of the Opera, whoever and whatever I was seeing. I don't know what I felt, or at least 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old me didn't know what he felt. Mm-hmm. But in retrospect, I think what he felt was happiness, as your title implies, and certainly a kind of comfort to be in the company of things beyond the everyday, which were not at that stage, and to a little weirdo like me, they were not scary per se. They were odd, perhaps unsettling, but I'm sure there are psychological terms for this, and I, in my ignorance, do not know them. But I felt at ease and welcomed into that world because it was a bigger world. It was a bigger world than blue collar, post-war. Liverpool was an industrial town that was quite heavily destroyed in the Blitz in World War II. Obviously, I'm not so old that I was a World War II kid, but rationing had only stopped a couple of years before I was born, and a lot of my childhood memories are playing in bomb sites. A lot of the buildings had yet to be replaced. I don't know why I went there. So it was a blue collar world of working class people in very quotidian lives with very quotidian attitudes. And I didn't know consciously that I was searching for or needed something bigger and brighter and weirder than that. But like so many of us, like all of us, I clearly did. And, Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine was an entree into a bigger, stranger world.
Was there any particular, because you mentioned a number of different categories, shall we say? You got the Famous Monsters, Universal Hammer, the Pan Book series.
Sure.
Were there any particular movies or stories that you remember specifically?
Oh, sure. Well, in fact, oddly, I can tell you the first genuine experience of being scared in a way that I did not like.
Okay.
And it was not what's hilarious and embarrassing.
Leave It to Beaver.
You see, you think you're kidding, don't you? But
no, I was 50-50.
Okay. It wasn't Leave It to Beaver, which I'm not sure we got that in the UK, at least not when I was a kid. What we did get, and I loved, was the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Okay.
What I now know in retrospect, it was a knowing riff on Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Invaders from Mars. That 50s Red Scare paranoia of the other among us. So in this episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, which is merely hilarious, I now realize, having watched it again, they were doing a riff on this. People, aliens, were infiltrating the world, and the way you could tell, but they looked like us. They looked like people you knew.
Right.
I think what got me was there were a few specific scenes that I found genuinely terrifying at the age of 8, but it was more this very gets under your skin concept of the world around you has changed. The people around you have changed. Everybody's in on it except you.
Yeah, everything has changed, but you haven't. Right, so you're now the the targeted outsider. It makes you very
absolutely
alienated
that
way.
And
disassociation.
Yeah. So it was my first exposure to that theme. But it was my first exposure to it, and it came wrapped up in one of my favorite television shows, a place of real comfort and pleasure and humor. So that was weirdly, it's so embarrassing, isn't it? It would be great when asked that question to say, oh yes, my first experience of real terror was when I read The Willows by Algernon Blackwood, or when I saw fill in the blank, But it's not. It's an episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show.
I thought you frame it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you could frame it that way, or you could focus on the things that made it scary to you. Like we were saying, very close to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is obviously well known as being in the horror canon. So there's that.
Yeah.
Did you have any scary dreams or reoccurring nightmares as a kid?
Never had recurring ones, thank God, because I find the concept of that really terrifying. That, oh my God, I'm back here. Would be pretty bad. I think I had my fair share of nightmares. So yeah, that was going on. But I've never really been plagued by nightmares.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, sure. And I don't know about you guys, but as I got older, I don't know if you'd even call them nightmares. The couple I remember as a kid were classically nightmarish, they were devils or demons or whatever. Now, if I have anxiety dreams, let's say, they're much more
real world.
Yeah, real world with a you know what, probably a little like that Dick Van Dyke episode, Ed. Something's wrong. These people around me mean me harm. But mostly it's the classics. I forget where I parked the car. Wait, I'm lost in this parking lot. But no recurring dream per se. I'm glad to say, relieved to say, I don't have no.
Okay. Was there ever a time in your childhood when you were terrified of something in real life?
If there had been terrible bullying in my infant and elementary, junior school, I would almost certainly have been on the receiving end of it. Once I went to the Blue Coat, which was the grammar school.
You were in the giving end?
I was a terrible bully. No, I was not. But I do remember, and this is a horrifying anecdote. I think we were kind of like the A-pack in the school. Yeah. We were the loudest. We were the ones that would make jokes in class. I was
intimidated.
I was certainly caned more often than most of my classmates. Because, yes, I grew up in the barbaric system of physical punishment by the asshole headmaster. And so I genuinely, hand on heart, I do not think we targeted or in any specific way did anything. But I think, because we've all, you're stuck on a tube train and there's a bunch of drunken yobs. There's a certain, even if they're not threatening you directly, there's a discomfort at being in this enclosed space with loudmouth and potentially violent people. And I'd hate to think there was any sense that me and my friends seemed potentially violent, but we probably were loud and boisterous, and it was probably discomforting in ways that we certainly had no intention of being.
Right.
And nor really any awareness of it.
It's kind of funny. This is reminding me of, and I'll share this because it may not be something that a lot of people in the U.S. know, but and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have read that, and this is slightly before my time, but the Rolling Stones and the Beatles had these two different images, but apparently based on where they grew up, the images were reversed, that it was the Liverpudlians that were the tougher crowd, and I don't know where the Rolling Stones grew up, but that they were not
the Londoners,
yeah. So maybe that's part of where this is coming from, is that you weren't conscious of your behavior, but it may have been
disconcerting or uncomfortable. Yeah, and by the way, I just have to fly the flag for the toughness of my hometown. Yeah, because everybody thought the Rolling Stones were swaggering, badass youth, and the Beatles were nice little pop kids. But the truth is, without being too class inverse snobbery about it, the Rolling Stones were all posh kids that went to art school in the London. Mick Jagger went to the London School of Economics, for Christ's sake. Whereas, the Beatles were fucking street thugs. They exaggerate for comic effect, Sir Paul, if you happen to listen. They were not thugs, but they were absolutely, blue collar kids with a bit of an attitude. Yeah. So yes, I've heard that story before, and you're quite right. Yeah.
Mm. So normally we ask a pair of questions here. One of them you may have just answered, but I'll ask it anyway. So we'll start with the negative question so we can end on the positive. The first question is, do you remember the first person you hurt?
Ooh, wow.
Yep.
This is not the kind of fun question I was expecting to.
Well, I'll tell you in advance. The follow-up question then is, do you remember the first person you helped? So starting with the negative first, and then
I'm trying to think the first person I had. I'm sure, like all of us, I had spoiled, nasty, ignorant moments, like letting a friend down or choosing to go to somebody's party instead of somebody else's.
Right.
Yeah.
Often the first things that come to mind for a reason, and it's the potential reason behind that might be interesting. And so if nothing comes to mind for you, that's fine, because not every question is going to hit. But if you did have something come to mind, then it'd be okay. Was it a parent? Was it a sibling? Was it a stranger? There's lots of different angles that conversation could then go.
No, I'm sure. I know, because I was a smart ass little bastard. I know that I probably took, just the wrong kind of pleasure in making siblings, cousins, friends look stupid. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of getting one over on them, laughing at them if they didn't understand something I understood, making a snide. Yeah, I think I was probably a little prick. I probably did quite a lot of that. But in that little prick's defense,
he was a little kid.
He was a little kid, yeah. And I think I can honestly say the conscious aim was not to hurt. I think the unconscious urge was to individuate and
self-promote.
Protect the self, who was probably infinitely less secure than he pretended to be.
Right.
But but it's still asshole behavior. And by the way, you guys are good at pulling this crap out of people. I have to admit, I still have that gene, and I have to be very careful about it, because, like all of us, you gravitate towards the peer groups what is comfortable with, and so most of my friends are smart and quick and funny. And I was about to say, but by no means all, which is I got a kind of B team of real
good fun.
Idiots that I hang around with. But if you are in the company of smart, quick, and funny people, especially Brits, because we're all pricks that way, there's a kind of there's an unconscious level of acceptable teasing. That is not seen as cruelty either by the perpetrator or by the recipient.
Right.
And
banter.
Standards are different in sounds very judgy about my beloved adopted country, but standards are different in the USA. And the kind of, because you wouldn't tease a stranger. That would be very cruel and bizarre thing to do. But it's kind of bizarrely, in the, chatterati groups, it's kind of a sign of affection. It's like, we're close enough that I can tease you because, you got your Schopenhauer mixed up with your Schrodinger or something. Ha, 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 aren't you stupid?
Right.
So there's an acceptable level of teasing that is, I think, genuinely seen on both sides as a sign of affection. Right. And in the US, although, obviously that happens, friends tease each other all the time, but there's a kind of
hesitance.
Yeah. especially if the kind of teasing is intellectual teasing or smarty pants teasing, I think it's a little less normal here, and therefore it's a little more uncomfortable. So one tries.
People are a little more thin-skinned here.
Yeah, it's like I swear to God, I never want people to feel ill at ease. I remember hearing a very good. I can't ascribe it to whoever came up with it, I'm afraid, but somebody said the true definition of a gentleman is one who makes the other person feel comfortable. And I heard that a long time ago, and I've always tried to live that way, to just accommodate, until they get abusive, and then you bite their hand off. But but I want to make the other person feel comfortable. So I'm very conscious about that kind of teasing, which can be fine with some Brits and not necessarily fine with some American people. So so I still, what I'm admitting to here is that somewhere in me there's still that biting little kid that is probably, again, just establishing, I'm okay. Look at me. I'm secure.
Yeah.
And it's terrible behavior, except when it's funny and amusing, which most of us find it. But
it's terrible behavior, except for when it's not.
Yeah, right.
I would say the American corollary to what you shared about being a gentleman is know thy audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Yeah, sure.
So the follow-up question to that is, do you remember the first person you helped?
Have you guys heard of the Windrush? There was because my original home nation had been one of the great colonizers and imperialists of the 18th and 19th century. There were all these places all over the world that spoke English, and at one time, sounds so creepy, had been owned by the British. And in the 50s, there was a lot of immigration, specifically called Windrush, people coming from the West Indies, Jamaica, and places like that. In other words, people who were not white people. So we had, through the 50s and 60s, there was a growing population of well, I guess it wouldn't be BIPOC because there wouldn't be indigenous, but black people and people of color, Indian people, Pakistani people, West Indian people, people from African countries.
I didn't know it was referred to as Windrush, but I am familiar with the fact that happened. Yes.
In fact, the guy I'm thinking of, come to think of it, well, I certainly won't name him. But he was Pakistani rather than West Indian. So, in fact, he would not be part of Windrush. That would be anyway. I was at Hay Green Road, so we would have been 9 or 10. And I hardly knew him, but me and a friend were walking away from school, and we found him and he was crying. And we asked him if he was hurt, and he hadn't been hurt. And then he said something about, and he named, a prick, a bullying prick. And I realized he didn't say so, but I realized, and I guess this was the first time in my life I'd seen it in action, that of course what had actually happened was that these assholes had called him a name, called him a racial slur. But it was emotionally devastating, actually. So in other words, I don't know if I did, I mean, the friend I was with, who I think was Les Thompson, an old friend of mine, we certainly comforted him, and made all the stupid noises that don't really help. And I don't know if it did help, but we certainly attempted to help in the moment, and we felt bad that he'd been emotionally hurt that way. So I'm sure there were earlier examples, and I hope there are many, many later examples. But now that you ask specifically, I think that is the first time I can remember wanting to help. Like, a moment where it was like, oh, you got to step up here, do something, make this kid feel better.
Consolation.
Sure.
Yeah. Was there ever a time in your childhood when you felt completely calm or safe or at bliss?
Are you nuts? I work in horror. What do you mean?
That's one of the best reactions to that question I've ever heard.
So that's a no.
No, you know what? What we just did then, that's when I felt safe. In shared laughter is usually when I felt safe as a kid.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't have particular. Maybe if I'd lived more rurally than urbanly, odd word, I would have memories of lying on, a grassy hill, staring up at a cloudless sky, surrounded by daffodils, and feeling at ease and at peace. But no, for the most part, no. But yeah, in moments of shared laughter, or again with, not wishing to put one's pretentious hat on, but in moments of shared creativity, like my first experiences in the arts were music, forming a band. And I worked in music and in theatre. And one of the pleasant aspects about being a screenwriter as well as a prose fiction writer is I like creative community. I like the Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney aspect of, hey, kids, let's do a show right here. And so being in a group with people making shit is, it can be, it's an odd word because it's not necessarily peaceful, but it is safe. And I notice you use the word safe. And it's not necessarily calm because it can be frenetic. If you're arguing with the other guitarist about, no, it's a C-sharp minor, you fucking moron. It's not, you're not exactly calm, right, but you are in fact surprisingly safe and happy. And actually, I would argue that even if you're yelling at each other, that's a superficial manifestation of the friction of excess creative energy. And in fact, you are in a calm and safe space. And I think when you share laughter or share creativity, or, I guess we can widen that out, obviously, to the warm feeling of sitting at a dinner table with friends or, all that. But as a kid, which is what you're asking about, I would guess it would be that when we found something funny, when one of us made a joke, we would feel. In other words, I don't think I was ever. Stillness is something that, if only because of literary associations, stillness is something I think of to associate with safety and calm. And I don't think I was particularly still as a kid.
Yeah. Something you can associate with safety and calm, but not childhood. That's for sure.
Right.
Yeah, right.
This is where I turn to Chris and pointedly say, see, confrontation can be a good thing.
Knock it off.
Well, context and tone are everything.
Yes,
this is true. This is true.
In other words, as who was I saying this to the other day? You can yell at your best friend in the most ridiculously abusive, aggressive manner, in a way that again, as we said earlier on the other topic, that you would never do to a stranger.
Right. Yeah.
Because there's a built-in safety. It's like, that there's the real bridge is below this bridge that you're burning metaphorically on top.
I like that. I can burn this bridge because there's one underneath it.
Yeah, right. It's a small drop. We'll both survive it.
The river's not that far below.
Yeah, right. Come on, it's warm.
No, I was laughing because when Chris replied with "knock it off," there was an inside joke.
Oh, yeah, right.
They're there.
Yeah.
All right, rolling into teen years then. some of our guests have reported where they're a fan of horror in their childhood and then maybe they veer away from it in their teens and then come back to it in their adults. Was that the case for you, or were you a fan of horror throughout your teens as well?
Pretty much throughout. There was one interesting thing that happened. And I didn't mention it earlier because I wasn't a kid, but there was a story in the Pan Book of Horror Stories, I forget which volume it was in, and it was so fucking terrifying that I said, I'm never reading this shit again. And I became a science fiction reader for a couple of years. But it didn't last long, but it was, oh God, wait a minute. It was the story. I should have done my homework before the episode, and I apologize because I can't remember the author's name. The story was called Magical Mystery Trip, which was obviously a riff on the Beatles title.
Right. And
I realized not long after, though several years after reading it, that it was really just a riff on a kind of acid trip.
Right.
But again, as with the Dick Van Dyke episode, what terrified me is that reality was melting around the protagonist. It was a very short story. But what was awful and what I found terrifying is that he could not articulate it. He could not tell the people, the real world people with whom he was interacting.
Oh, you mean the protagonist of the story couldn't?
Yes, he could not convey the nightmare he was living. Including at one point, I remember an image. It sounds silly now. It's not that scary. But he was in the scene with the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist had detached itself and floated around the room like a balloon with a rictus grin on its face. And that particular image I does not sound particularly scary to me, but it was because that, a psychiatrist is traditionally a person one goes to for help. So the fact that he was trying to tell, it was psychiatrist or therapist, counselor, whoever it was, what was going on, but not only could he not, something always stopped him from saying it, but while he was there trying to say it, this shit was happening. And I found that sense of nobody could help you in this situation. You can't even tell them you're in trouble. And I found that very disturbing. So at the age of 12, I formally renounced my affiliation and loyalty to horror and said I would go to science fiction. And I did for, I don't know, a year.
You'll be back.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be waiting. We know you'll come back. And I did go back, partly because, science fiction ran out of its very limited fucking pleasures for me. Because I'm that generation. I had loved 2001. Space Odyssey, the Kubrick movie. And I had naively assumed that if I made the switch from horror, which had just upset me, to science fiction, I was going to find a world full of the kind of cutting edge, metaphysical fantasy exploration that 2001 offered. And of course, it ain't. That's not what science fiction does. It's full of fucking nerds.
There's some good gems here and there.
I joke. I have many science fiction. Yes. But I did not find the same satisfactions in traditional science fiction that I found in hard science fiction. Leaves me cold. Space opera is fine. John Carter of Mars, Star Wars, love it. But the clever stuff, the stuff based on, science, is not really my wheelhouse. So I came back into horror. So I didn't really abandon it, except it's interesting that you asked the question that way. And it's interesting that is a pattern of behavior that you've seen and isolated. So I guess I'm slightly anomalous in that it was a very conscious, a specific triggering moment made me grandstand and renounce it. But it was bullshit. You know, I was soon back because that's really where home base is. And the next thing to really terrify me was The Exorcist, because again, I'm that generation who saw The Exorcist on first theatrical release. But that's not really what you're at. That's later. But yeah, in terms of, although technically I was still a teenager when I saw The Exorcist. Well, technically I was definitely a teenager. 17, I think, when it came out.
So, The Exorcist. Anything else in your teens really stand out to you as being memorable in terms of horror?
Was I still? Well, I was just about to hit a couple of years after that. Not that I had avoided horror, but I was about to hit my favorite period, basically. Okay. When did I turn 20? Late 75, I turned 20. So yeah, we can call it late teenage. This golden window of two of my favorite filmmakers, Brian De Palma and Dario Argento. It was like this golden run of Suspiria and Carrie and The Fury and Inferno and Tenebrae and De Palma's earlier ones, even Sisters. Well, I guess you can't call Obsession a horror movie. It's Hitchcockian. But anyway, there was this. Yeah, my teenage years ended happily with a complete re-embracing. Well, like I say, it's not that I had turned my back on it at all, but I was lucky enough to live through a second golden age, at least in my opinion, of horror movies with those particular guys. I mean, obviously, you know, I guess by the time Halloween came out, I was 21 or so. But obviously, Wes Craven, John Carpenter, other people as well. I'm not dissing the other horror auteurs of that period, but the people that pressed my buttons for sure the most were peak Argento and peak De Palma.
I have often shared on this program that so when I was in college, I had a break of about 2.5 hours between classes, and there was a student lounge that had some pool tables. And so I used to go on between these breaking classes and play pool. And over a period of a semester or two, playing enough, I got actually really good at shooting pool. Enough that I reached a level where I realized that the difference between me and some of the other better players is not, how can I say this? When you get to a certain level, not only in playing pool, but all of life, I think, what separates one person from another is not who makes certain choices, but who makes the fewer mistakes. And
okay,
yeah, good.
But when it comes to art, there are no mistakes; there are only choices. And so, for example, there where you said you didn't want to diss any of the other auteurs, De Palma and Argento pushed the right buttons for you. Yeah, that's what it is about art. Is you know, there are no mistakes. It's just like you say, who pushed the right buttons for you? Which creators made the same choices you would have made in the same situation?
Yeah, I absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, I think, and again, I'd be far from the first person to observe this, but the commonality that those two have, again, no disrespect to the others, but it's that. Well, it's funny because Argento made a movie called Opera, but they are fucking operatic, De Palma and Argento. It is big strokes, big emotions, flair, very high style, operatic.
Operatic, I like that. Like, I don't know if you've seen it, but the recent reboot of Nosferatu, I kept trying to liken it to a play or something. Like, it was just, it was very over the top with certain scenes, like the setting and the design and the character acting. Operatic. It's a good word for it.
Well, it certainly sounds less judgy than over the top.
yeah, exactly. It's more of a positive term than over the top. Right. Operatic.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm ashamed to say, and I'll leave my badge and my gun on your desk, Lieutenant. But I've not yet seen the remake. So,
I'm glad I didn't mention any spoilers.
I hear he has a mustache.
One of them's a vampire, right?
One of them is a vampire, and there's a lady, and there's some horses too.
Yeah.
So you mentioned.
Actually, I mean, I haven't seen it, and I probably shouldn't sidetrack you, but I hear bad things about the mustache. Seriously.
The mustache looks fine. It's not, the bald guy with the rat face and the buck teeth. So people don't like it.
Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned Suspiria and Carrie were the first two in the list that you made. So I'm going to start with those.
Sure.
What did you like about Suspiria, other than possibly just the operatic terminology?
It's boldness, I guess. It's absolute. I mean, it depends how technically we want to. I mean, just the level of attention to its color palette was breathtaking, and its commitment to excess and its lack of timidity. It's yeah. If you separated Suspiria into its elements, I would say, and again, we're healthy adults analyzing here. I am in no way dissing my elders and betters. But if we were to separate it into the elements that cohere into the artistic thing that is Suspiria, the story would be the least interesting aspect to me. I mean, a bunch of cute girls in a dance academy, that's a great way to start any story. I'm not objecting to that. The fact that punchline, do you still need to say spoilers on a 52-year-old movie? You probably don't.
I don't think so. I think it's been
They're fucking witches. It's a witches comic. So the story was like, well, in the wrong hands, this would just be, a terrible Saturday night made-for-TV 1970s movie. But it isn't in the wrong hands. It's in the absolutely right hands of a visionary committed to emotional communication, perhaps more than narrative communication. Suspiria does not, I mean, of course it works, but it is not operating on a narrative level in terms of what it wants to do to you as the recipient. It is operating on an emotional, psychological, visual level, like the high arts, like ballet, like opera.
So let me ask you this. If the story wasn't as important to you and the emotional communication was, what emotion was it communicating to you?
Well, this is, I think what it was. Don't get me wrong, there were scary bits in it. I was scared. In fact, one of the scariest bits is one of the dumbest because it's just so in your face, B-movie level. But, when I get spoilers, when somebody approaches somebody else with like fucking pins already stuck in her eyes and says as a threat, it's death. I'm going to take it. I can't remember what the line is. But it's almost as bad as you're going to meet death now. It's ridiculous on one level, but the commitment of the presentation of the moment stops it being ridiculous. It's fucking scary, but it's and I think this is how horror makes me happy. Horror makes me happy because it gives me, along with all the other stuff, the horror I like, it gives me splendor. And in the same way that the climax of Carrie is splendid. It is large scale, again, operatic, we'll say. And Suspiria is splendid from beginning to end. Its concern is the splendid. Visual splendor, emotional splendor, nut job, brilliant soundtrack splendor.
So moving into adult years then, what two or three things really...
I'm old, right? Because this is going to be a 3-hour episode. If we're only just moving into adulthood, my God.
You didn't let me finish the question.
Okay, sorry.
I was going to say, what are the first 2 or 3 things that come to mind in terms of things that stand out to you from your adult years?
In terms of my relationship with horror, and
yes,
again, in a way, I've cheated on this one, haven't I? Because that little golden period I mentioned of peak Argento and De Palma would actually bridge my late teenage years right through to my mid-20s.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think somewhere along the way, and we haven't discussed it at all, I was discovering, as well as the movies we talked about, I was discovering wonderful writers.
Right.
And I'm trying to think the sad fact is, I think most of the things that have knocked me out over, how old am I? Over the 45 years since I became an adult, 45 plus years since I became an adult. I think most of the things that have knocked me out are probably outside the genre. I think most of my, oh my God, look at this, or listen to this, or read this, have been in possibly related genres, but not necessarily horror per se, which doesn't mean I stopped enjoying it. I mean, during that time, obviously, I became a practitioner myself. Maybe in a weird way that both sort of broadens, because you got to keep your antenna up. So it broadens your input field.
Okay. Let me try asking the question a different way, because we've briefly touched on this already. I think at one point in the call, something that comes up very often when talking to creators in the business is they have a certain love for different pieces of art out there for cerebral reasons tied to their creative process. My own personal instinct is that a cerebral love for something is not necessarily the same as a gut level instinctual love for something. Sure. And we like to try to focus on the gut level ones, because it's not to say that cerebral love for something isn't also valid, but I think a lot of the cerebral stuff is based on deeper gut level things. And it's like, right. How can I say this? It's additional too, but if we can get to the emotional stuff, then that's really where the heart of it is. For lack of a better way to say that. So if we were to say, in the adult years, even if it's not necessarily pure horror, is there something that has stood out to you that's connected to you in that way, even if it's cross genre?
Well, I can think of a couple of examples, and there is a sort of cross line through them. Although, even now I'm going back 30 plus years. Okay. But I remember seeing Reservoir Dogs, and I remember being annoyed at how clearly I was in the presence of a new master, somebody who was really good at doing this stuff. And also, the scene where Michael Madsen says "Alone at Last" and Steelers Wheel starts playing. Obviously, it's not a horror movie, but that filled me with dread, as it did most people at the screening. And the reason I think there's a crossover to the fiction I started enjoying is Tarantino went on to make a version of an Elmo Leonard novel. And the discovery of Elmo Leonard and John le Carré, the joy of discovery of those two writers, I remember that being a particular kind of standout for me. The voice is all important. Again, like when I said in Suspiria, the story, fine, but it's the telling, it's the delivery that really sings. And back when I was younger, most of my favorite writers, though again, I would not have been capable of articulating it this way back then, but my favorite writers were voice writers. But discovering Elmo Leonard and John le Carré, both of whom are very different in their voices and approaches, but both of whom, like Chandler and Woodhouse, are pretty much masters of the language. So in other words, I guess I like to see the instrument played properly. I want to hear somebody who knows what they're doing. And that doesn't really answer your question. I'm sorry. I'm trying not to... It's
okay. I was enjoying the analogy. It's like you go see a cover band and they don't do exactly the same song.
Yeah,
they offer some, some differentiation on it.
Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned these these two authors,
Yes.
Elmore Leonard. So let's say, what would be maybe your favorite book that he had written?
Oh, God, I don't know. Weirdly, I'm very fond of, I think people who are hardcore Elmore fans, they tend to look not so fondly on the last couple of decades of the work, but I do. Because I think the voice got even more distilled in the late 90s. So, from, Get Shorty, Be Cool, Tishomongo Blues, around this period, it's down to the fucking essence. I mean, there are no metaphors, there are no observations. It is superbly delivered dialogue.
Well, what I was trying to get at.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So we talked about the difference between the cerebral and the gut level instinct. And for example, with Elmore Leonard, the things that you've described so far have been the cerebral stuff. So I was hoping that if I could ask you which maybe book of his was your favorite, I was wondering if there was an emotional connection to that, and if so, what, and then we could talk about that.
Sure. The emotional connection I actually get from Elmore Leonard is it's more the joy of seeing something done well. He's a very funny writer, a very clever writer, and I don't want this to sound reductionist. I don't know if there's a lot of emotional connectivity really going on in there, other than, relating back to those questions you asked earlier. I feel safe in an Elmore, not in a reductionist, cozy way, but I feel safe because it is a space where there is between, the theoretical space between author and audience. That is a space in his books of laughter and creativity and cleverness. And I think, I don't want to be the guy who somebody says, I heard that podcast you did. How dare you suggest there's no emotional depth to Elmore Leonard? What I'm saying is the pleasures I get from Elmore Leonard are...
As a peer, maybe?
Oh, certainly, massive admiration just for the skill deployed in how he tells the story and how he manipulates the language. Yeah, and that would be the same with Le Carré as well, I think. That there is, inevitably, once one becomes a practitioner, it is potentially more difficult to read somebody else's work, what would you say, innocently, because there's a little extra eye when you're reading it, which is would I have done it that way? Can I learn how to do it that way? Oh, I would never do it that way. That's bad.
I have read that once you get to be a professional, nobody wants to read other people's works. What's the word?
Well, you try to turn off not the analytic in the terms of the interpretation of the work you're reading. You want an analytic as well as an emotional eye, but you can't help but have your admiration and occasionally envy triggered by certain masterful displays of skill.
Let's see. I'm going to skip some of the other questions here.
Because I've gone on too long?
No.
But...
well, mainly because I think some of this stuff would be repeats of stuff we've already talked about.
Sure.
The next question will be not only about horror, but about any genre, and will cover your entire life. Not any particular period. But what movie would you say you have watched more times than any other?
Well, that is particularly and specifically interesting in my case, because I'll tell you right now, the odds are it was a movie made in 1968.
Okay.
In 1968, I watched 5 or 6 movies as many times as I possibly could. And in 1968, I'm not going to name anything that I only saw 5 or 6 times. Actually, let me preface this for your younger listeners that I want you to be aware of the dedication and effort that this took in 1968. Because, kids, never mind streaming, we didn't have cable. You had to, if a movie you liked was there, go back the next day and see it again. Because
you couldn't even see it 2 times in the same day. I get that.
Well, you say that, but in one particular instance of this list I'm about to give, you could, and I did, because
that's what they call the matinee.
Well, yeah, the matinee. But they used to. I assume this happened in the US as well as the UK. But there used to be this phrase that you would see in the newspaper ads for a movie. And this was the norm rather than something unusual. They would use the phrase continuous performances, which meant that when the cinema opened at 11 a.m. or whatever it was, the projectionist would put the movie on, and at the end of the movie, he'd put the movie on again.
Right. I didn't know they were still doing that into the 60s.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. So at a lot, in fact, like I say, it was the norm at the vast majority. Not the posh ones in the center of town, but certainly the suburban cinemas. They would play a movie, depending on its length, 4 or 5 times a day. And if you
would pay and you'd go in and watch it from whatever point you started and then wait for it to start over again and then watch from the beginning to the point that you walked in and then you could leave.
Yeah. And so let me name the movies that I saw. I'm not even going to mention things I saw 5 times or fewer, because that's for amateurs. I saw 2001, Once Upon a Time in the West, Bonnie and Clyde, and weirdly, and this is some weird sort of hangover where childhood was giving way to adolescence. So those 3, obviously, I'm very proud of having seen. And then the 4th one is Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. and then the 5th one, it was Planet of the Apes. So those 5 movies I saw in 1968 and possibly into 60. Actually, yeah, because I don't think 2001 was released till 69. So actually, if I'm being honest, I should remove that from that magical year of 68. But yeah, I would go back every day.
Well, of the ones that you mentioned for things you'd watched most often, Once Upon a Time in the West seems to be, how can I say this?
Well, it's the longest.
Well, it's different. It's different from the others and different from other things that we've talked about so far in this call.
Oh, that's interesting.
At least it seems to be to me, but maybe that's because I don't know the movie as well as you do. So I was going to say, let's talk about that. What did you like about it?
Well, weirdly, same old shit. It's fucking splendid. It is huge and operatic. And again, on the story level, it's very pulpy. It's a revenge story. I'm not knocking revenge stories.
Well, hang on. So if you think that one is similar to the other things that we've talked about, and do you think that the others, Bonnie and Clyde, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, or Planet of the Apes, do you think that any of those are different?
Out of this.
Okay. Okay. So
not knocking it. Couple of good songs,
right?
Oh, it's Dick Van Dyke as well. You see how he keeps recurring in the life?
Full circle.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. Go ahead with your point. Yeah.
So, Bonnie and Clyde or Planet of the Apes. Do you think that either one of those highlights something other than what we've already talked about in the call?
Can we, without being in the biggest sense dismissive of Planet of the Apes, can we dismiss Planet of the Apes? Because I think that was just, I liked it. It was a fun sci-fi adventure movie. But Bonnie and Clyde, I was obsessed with.
Okay.
And yeah, clearly it's not a horror movie. But if we're talking about the psychology of a person who is drawn to horror in fiction or cinematic forms, and again, I'm going to pull back those adjectives we've used before, but the balletic aspect of the spoilers death at the end of the. Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
They both die?
It's a real fucking downer. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. But it is a splendidly shot and still kind of disturbing 50, 60 years later. And it is, and unlike the other one, I think this probably is the kind of thing that can permeate even into a 12-year-old's nascent consciousness. The confluence and overlap of love and death. There's a moment just before the sheriff's guns tear them to pieces where I think Bonnie realizes it's a trap. They've been betrayed by CW's dad. And Clyde sort of gets it because Bonnie gets it. And they lock eyes. And I'm certainly not overreading the performances. This is clearly how it was directed. Clyde briefly, is there anything we can do? Can we get out of this? Whereas Bonnie just gives him a look, which sort of says, in a very gentle way, we're going to die now, but it's okay. And I doubt very much that, that one moment late in the movie of we're going to die now, but it's okay, I love you. I doubt that was the hook that brought me back 14 times. I think gangster fun, period clothes, bluegrass music, odd cars, all those hooks were certainly working on me as well. But I'm going to hazard a guess, given that we're talking about the psychology of what draws us to horror, that, Bonnie and Clyde made me happy. That's what a weird thing to say. But possibly it made me happy because of that. That one day, perhaps, we all will have a Bonnie Parker that looks at us at a crucial moment and, on our deathbed and says, we're going to die now, but it's all right. I love you. So I don't know. You made me think about that. I'd not articulated that before, but that's something.
It does align with some of
good in that beret. So come on.
It does align with some of the things that I think would be good summaries for this call, which we'll get to here in a few minutes. Yeah. Do you see any common threads about what kind of horror you like? Cannibalism, occult, metaphysical,
operatic?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, what I really like, when I was a kid, horror, the word horror, it was a big tent. It covered everything. From the gentlest supernatural ghost story to, the ballsiest in-your-face stalk and slash. And nobody felt that, well, my sense was, nobody felt the need to subcategorize or subdivide or say, well, this is horror and that isn't. What I really like is the fantastic. And I mentioned Orphe earlier, the Cocteau movie. I mean, obviously that's not a horror movie. But in the big tent that I grew up with, it's in the same tent because it's about love and death. It's about life and death. It's about the spaces between life and death and the interconnectivity between life and death. It is about the interface of the supernatural and the natural presented as a romance, which is very often the underpinning of much trashier movies. The uncanny can target its victim / beloved. I've totally lost track. What were we saying?
So this would be the spot where we talk about any common themes that have cropped up throughout the call, and then how about how those are important to you and how they intersect with the genre.
Sure.
So what I've got in my notes here is basically a dichotomy, really.
Oh, Oh, you do surprise me. What are you saying? I'm schizophrenic? I'm bipolar?
Only slightly.
What?
So I think it may have started out with, wanting to expand beyond Liverpool. You talked about wanting something larger, and this ties in with things like splendor, right. Intellect, the self-promotion to cover insecurity, things beyond the everyday. I had a note here about not feeling afraid, but felt happy and comfort in relation to, what was it, the Hammer Horror and Universal.
Sure.
So there's community there, and let me scroll back down. But so it's this dichotomy of wanting to sort of leave the community, but also have community, because in terms of the community side of things, you talked about the times where you felt happy or safe or comfortable was in creative community. That was where I picked up on that word initially. Shared laughter, shared creativity. Mm-hmm. We talked about how sci-fi is a little too cold or intellectual for you, that you want the emotional connection that comes with the community. Also, going back to that first situation and some of the child that you helped, you were trying to console them, even though you didn't feel that you felt that you did a good job of it. The attempt was there to connect with this person on an emotional level. And then the dichotomy part of this is that some of the stronger fears that you have mentioned have to do with disassociation, where you're feeling other, away from, pulled apart.
Sure.
And so I really liked what you said about the summary there with Bonnie and Clyde, about it being this confluence and overlap of love and death, is sort of this, the boundary between the two, between the community and the disassociation from that community.
Right.
The natural follow-up there would be, why are these things important to you? I think you already maybe addressed that earlier in the call. You mentioned you wanted somebody to be there at the end to say that it's okay.
Yeah, right.
Who doesn't?
Well, yeah, I remember a therapist once saying to me when I wanted to stress that my panic attacks were more about existential angst or metaphysical dread than making my books balance. And I said, no, you don't get it. It's death. I don't want to die. I'm afraid of death. And the therapist said, well, yeah, I mean, that is something ultimately we all have to do alone. And I was like,
and then you're like, that's exactly the point.
Jesus Christ, what am I paying you for? But I will also, I say this lightly, of course, but you're being kind when you say dichotomy between community and leaving a community, because I think the much uglier but possibly truthful way of saying that is, no, it's not a dichotomy. It's just elitism. I wanted a better community. And by which I don't know. Well, obviously, I did want to hang out with fellow artists and fellow creators, of course. Like seeks like. That's normal. But I think it all comes back to fear of death, I think. Because the community I really want to belong to is a community in which death is meaningless. It's a community in which Dr. Pretorius can make life in a laboratory. It's a community in which Dracula can give us immortal life just by biting us. It's a community in which death is personified as a hot French princess who drives a Rolls Royce with motorcycle outriders. And it's like, oh boy, death's fine. Let me walk through that mirror to find death. That's Cocteau's Orpheus I'm talking about.
Oh, and now we're back to Bonnie and Clyde.
And Bonnie and Clyde, yeah. So I think, I don't really, I think I just wanted to make the cheap shot joke about it was elitism, not.
Well, it's funny that you said that, because what you said is, I wanted a better community, but that doesn't mean you didn't want community. It just, you know what I'm saying?
Sure. Yeah. Right.
So I think
you can want soup, but also want good soup,
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But I'll drink soup. It's if all they've got is the bad soup.
Well,
it's Woody Allen made that, isn't it? Didn't he do a riffing on the this food is terrible? Yes, and such small portions. He made that same analogy of that with our fear of death. And I can't quite remember how the gag worked, but it was the same sort of thing. It's like, yeah, look, life is terrible, but I don't want to die.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, his great line about that, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, is I can't remember if he said it himself in an interview or if he gave it to a character in one of his scripts, but he says, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality by not dying.
Yes.
which is pretty good.
So the usual follow-up question here that we ask is, why horror? Could you explore this in other genres?
Yeah.
You kind of touched on that during the childhood or adolescence with why horror over sci-fi, when you abandoned horror to go to sci-fi, but then eventually came back.
Yeah. The thing is, I really am small c Catholic in my tastes. I like comedy, I like romance, I like crime fiction, I like musicals. Horror in, as I've said, the old sense, the big tent sense, is absolutely the wheelhouse, the home base for me. But why horror? I don't know that it is horror to the exclusion of everything else. Certainly, I have friends who literally only like horror movies. It's
right.
Like they don't want it. The Great Escape, does it have zombies? Then fuck you. I'm not watching that.
Worry.
That is also a potential answer to the question is, if you were to say, well, I do explore these themes in my other works that are, non-horror or in the other films and books that I enjoy too.
Well, actually, I would like to quote my friend, relevant to what you just said, but to flip it back to horror. It's like my friend, the great Ramsey Campbell, a venerated master of horror literature. He sort of very self-consciously never shies away from, he's a very awarded and respected writer, as he should be. And he very consciously always, every time he's interviewed or gives a bio for a book or something, his first sentence is always, I write horror, because he doesn't want to look like he's turning his back on the genre that nurtured him. But he then usually goes on to say that one of the reasons he writes horror is that within horror, he can find, both as a consumer and as a practitioner, he can find everything else. Yeah. Horror contains humor, romance, mystery, suspense. So there's no need. I suppose that could be said of, if you could say that about any genre or any form, but clearly we who are drawn to it, even though we don't only want zombie movies, we want the other things that can be contained within horror, we nevertheless choose as the medium by which those things can be accessed the horror portal rather than the rom-com portal or the, whatever. So, well, I can shed no further light on that question, gentlemen. I mean, you've been doing this show a long time. You should have the answer down pat by now. Why horror? How many varied answers have you had, by the way? Is there a consensus? There can't be.
No, there's no consensus. Right. There are common themes, and that is part of why we're doing this. We sort of had three goals in mind for the show. Obviously, fans of yours can hear you, potentially hear you share something that you haven't shared elsewhere. Right. The second goal is, we don't shy away from difficult topics. So if difficult topics come up, then maybe guests will hear us get to address those in a healthy manner. And then the third goal is to sort of gather some numbers on this to find out, okay, not everybody's going to fall into the same bucket, but how many buckets are there? Which ones are more common? Which ones are least common?
Nice.
As a matter of fact, we have just passed our 5th year anniversary. So
wow, congratulations. That's great.
Thank you. I'm working on tallying up the numbers as we speak to potentially write a book about what we've learned thus far. And, if we get to a 10-year anniversary, maybe do a second follow-up book to say, did everything pan out the way we thought it was? Did the numbers change in the next 5 years kind of thing? So,
that's
in
great.
terms of giving a summary, I can't really yet because I'm still tallying all that stuff up.
Sure.
But yeah, it's something that we've heard from more than one person that, as you say, horror can contain everything else.
Mm-hmm. It is legal.
If you try with any other genre and then start adding some of the more horrific elements, it just becomes
It just
horror.
becomes a horror version of that.
Right.
So, for example,
that's interesting, isn't it? It's true. If you add, what would be an easy, like From Dusk Till Dawn? If it's a gangster movie, and again, spoilers if anybody on the
there are
hasn't seen
vampires.
it. Yeah, it's like at that point, it is. I'm repeating what you just said. I think it's true that at no point does, once horror intrudes, it's never a gangster movie with horror elements.
Yeah.
It's never a
it's a
rom-com
horror
with
gangster
horror
movie.
elements.
Yeah.
It's always a horror movie with the other elements.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether we should be smug or horrified about that. But it's a kind of...
Oh, that's good.
It's the genre that eats all other genres.
Yes.
There was something you said earlier in the call about Bonnie and Clyde and what you liked about it. I don't remember the exact wording because I was busy doing something with, summarizing my notes.
Making yourself a coffee? Thanks, man.
Well, what I was going to say is that I was going to make the comment that it was amusing that based on what you said, it sounded like you were a very good fit for Hellraiser 2 and 3 because the things that you were talking about were themes that were very, very relevant to those movies.
Oh, well, thank you. That's, it's a funny thing about, people say, well, what are you, it's very hard, at least for me. It's probably not hard for anybody else. I'm just stupid. It's difficult for me to differentiate between enthusiasms and influences. And, I don't know. I'm never consciously, I'm sure you guys hear this a lot from your guests. There are always exceptions, but for the most part, creativity is, the intellect is usually applied at rewrite stage.
Right.
Rewrite, I use metaphoric, whatever the form. Usually,
you don't criticize while you're brainstorming.
Yeah, right. First drafts, whether that means a rough drawing of what's going to be a painting, or the first few notes of what's going to be a symphony, or literally in literature or screenplays cases, the first draft. First drafts tend to be instinctive and organic. There are always exceptions, of course. People work differently. But I think for the most part, it's organic and instinctive. And on second drafts and rewrites and polishes, then you can allow the analytic half of your brain out of the cage because it might spot what you were trying to do. You just splurge it out in the first one, and then when you polish it, like, oh, this appears to be about this. So let's now highlight and burnish and put in some connections. But yeah, I think generally the intellect is applied, again, I say this in the most general senses, is applied at editorial or corrective stages rather than initial inspirational stages. Right.
Well, this would be the point where we ask, is there anything else that you think is relevant that you didn't get a chance to say? Maybe you had a thought earlier and then the conversation took a left turn?
Well, I mean, I'm glad to say, because it's always a sign of a good conversation, that we took many, many left turns. and as always, there are sidebars and danglers that, I've already forgotten because I'm old, that we'll never get back to. But that is the joy of ongoing conversations of all stripes, isn't it?
Sure.
No, I certainly, and we've covered a lot of ground. You guys are great. So no, there's no sort of, I can't believe they didn't ask X. Though I'm sure when I listen to this on playback, I'll think, oh God,
of course,
meant to pick up on that.
Yes,
but yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you to anybody out there. Oh, you know what? Before we hit the closing, did you want to repeat? Well, actually, no, that's right. You can't because you're under NDA. I was going to ask. Do you want to?
Yeah. I have a social media presence, so if anybody is kind enough to be interested, but both the TV project that I was working on and all my old shit and my books and stuff, I regularly post what is cunningly disguised as a humorous observation on something, but is, of course, a naked ploy to drive you to my Amazon page where you can buy my books.
Yes. We're going to put together a bio.
They can find me out there.
We're going to put together a bio page for you and put it on our site and link to whatever it is that you'd like us to link to.
Terrific. So, thank you. Great.
Anybody who wants to find links to his works, you can just come to our page, go to the episodes page, and then scroll down to where your name will be. So again, thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon, and thank you to anybody out there listening. Do please come visit us at horrormakesushappy.com. Check out Peter's page and all the other stuff on our website, and if nothing else, tell a friend.